What's up, everybody? We're back. Corey Hughes, Bloody History. All right, we're continuing. 8 plus 2 equals 10, part 6. I hope you guys enjoyed the interview I had with Johnny Vedmore. I did that last year, but I just had stumbled across the recording of it. I thought it was pretty good. I like Johnny. Johnny's good at what he does. And so, but yeah, here we're going to continue on with this. Part 6. If you guys haven't bought the book yet, please go and buy the book. It's on Amazon.com. So I've been doing a lot of thinking about what I'm going to do next, and I'm moving here in the next couple weeks, just up the street here, no big deal. And I'm going to start writing again once I get settled in. So I'm figuring end of April, beginning of May, I'm going to start knocking out some chapters. Now, I'm undecided as to what I'm going to do with these chapters. Am I going to add them to Warning from History and make it like an 800 fucking page, epic single volume book? Am I going to write a sequel to Warning from History? That to me seems like a lot of work, and it seems like needs a lot more research to fill in a lot of the gaps. I'm feeling like a whole second book is going to take me a couple years to knock out, and I can get these 4, 5, or 6 chapters into an updated second edition of A Warning from History, and I can have that done by the end of the year, and I think that's what I want to do, even though I keep flip-flopping. But needless to say, these current first edition books, I think I've sold somewhere in the neighborhood of 700, maybe a little more than 700. Especially the hardcovers, these are going to become collector's items because the split second I'm finished with this update, those will no longer be available for sale. And I promise you, there will have been less than like 400 or 500 of those hardcovers. And if you try to find a Michael Collins Piper first edition, you're paying $600, $700, $1,000 for that first edition. So I highly recommend everyone pick up a copy of the hardcover. And if you want a signed copy, you can get that from me directly. So... But, all right, enough of my rambling. Let's get back to the subject at hand. And today what we're going to do is we're going to spend most of our time, actually all of our time, on Harold Weisberg's documents surrounding Roy Kellerman. Kellerman was an assistant special agent supervisor in Dallas in the motorcade, and so Weisberg felt that his statements were questionable at best, and we've got a pretty lengthy letter by Weisberg, or analysis by Weisberg at the end of this, into Kellerman's statements. But we're going to go over his statements, a couple news articles, that kind of stuff, and that should do it for today. So let's begin. A handwritten note at the top of this. All the handwritten notes are going to be by Harold Weisberg. It says, Kellerman knew of Bullitt before leaving Parkland. Recalls only one large hole in head, no small holes in head. Memorandum to Ken Klein from Jim Kelly and Andy Purdy, date August 29th, 1977. Interview with Roy Kellerman, 8/24/77 and 8/25/77, Holiday Inn, North St. Petersburg, Florida. Mr. Kellerman was interviewed because of his participation in the autopsy of President Kennedy. On the flight from Dallas to Andrews Air Force Base, Mr. Kellerman heard Berkeley and Clifton arranging contacts for the autopsy. Kellerman heard that the choice was between Walter Reed and Bethesda, and heard them announce that the autopsy would be at the Naval Hospital in Bethesda. Prior to landing at Andrews, Kellerman was told by Mr. Bain of Secret Service that he should stay with the body. Just before the plane was to land, Agent Greer came to the front of the plane and told Mr. Kellerman that Mrs. Kennedy wanted the Secret Service people who had been with the president in the car to help it appears to be missing a page here. It says in the president's car to help, and then it jumps to Fink told him that, quote, we share knowledge. So it seems to be missing a page, yes. And this is page number 3. Yes, we're missing page number 2, unless it's out of order. Oh, it looks like we're missing page number 4 also. So I love when they do this fucking nonsense. Let's just take a couple pages out of this report. No one will ever notice. Mr. Kellerman recalls that at least one X-ray negative was displayed in the autopsy room as the doctors were trying to determine if they could find any bullet fragments. Kellerman said that the X-ray was of the head and showed a whole mass of stars, the only large piece being behind the eye, which was given to the FBI agents when it was removed. Kellerman was asked to what extent he knew the nature of the president's wounds from his observations in Parkland Hospital. Kellerman said, "I went into the emergency room where the body was. The face was unmarked. I saw no blood in the neck. The shirt and tie were still on." Kellerman said he never noticed the wound in the throat at Parkland, and he didn't see the tracheotomy after he was in the emergency room. He said he just took one look. Kellerman said that when he and Hill helped to move the body, Kellerman held the legs and Hill held the shoulders and head area. Kellerman said, quote, he never had at the morgue. He said he, quote, knew the throat had been opened for oxygen. Kellerman said the doctors had no problem with the organs. He heard a young corpseman who was examining the organs say they are very clean and clear. Kellerman does not recall the doctors lifting the brain out of the head and only recalls one large hole in the head and no small holes in the head. He knew that Hill said there was a hole in the tie, but he didn't see it. Kellerman recalls Dr. Fink probing the wound about 4 to 5 inches as he was trying to, quote, get the probe to come out. Kellerman said the doctor didn't probe the wound with his finger first, saying that it was not that big. Though he had a discussion with Boring about the skull fragments, he does not recall them attempting to fit them in. In fact, he only remembers one skull fragment. And that's where that report cuts off. Date November 30th, 1963, to the Chief. From ASIC Kellerman, 1-16. Subject, security measures taken for the late President Kennedy and President Johnson from Parkland Memorial Hospital, Dallas, Texas, to the U.S. Naval Hospital, Bethesda, Maryland, and to the White House on November 22nd and 23rd, 1963. When the late President Kennedy and the official motorcade departed Love Field, Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963, S.A.'s Lawson, 84 and Ribka Garage remained at the airport to effect security at the plane during our absence. On arrival at the emergency room at Parkland Memorial Hospital, Dallas, Texas, the agents who worked the Secret Service follow-up car, 8-Sec Roberts shift, were utilized to cover the entrances and corridors leading to the emergency room. Shortly thereafter, 8-Sec Stout, 4 p.m. to 12 p.m., and his shift reported to me at the emergency room for instructions. I then conferred with ASIC Rufus Youngblood, who was in charge of security for the then Vice President Johnson, and told him to take 8-Sec Roberts and his shift to supplement his agents, and that I would take 8-Sec Stout and his agents with me until we returned to Washington, D.C. The change of shifts was immediately made at the hospital. Vice President Johnson departed the Parkland Memorial Hospital prior to the departure of the body of President Kennedy, with ASIC Roberts' shift working the Secret Service follow-up car on their arrival at Love Field. ASIC Roberts and his shift was completely secured the area where the president's plane was spotted. En route to Washington, D.C., aboard Air Force One, that's USAF 26000, another conference was held with ASIC Youngblood, where he was informed that he would have 8-Sec Stout and his shift with him on their arrival at Andrews Air Force Base, Washington, D.C. I also informed him that I was accompanying the body of the late President Kennedy to the U.S. Naval Hospital, Bethesda, Maryland, and would have with me Special Agents Hill, Landis, Greer, and O'Leary. When we arrived at Andrews Air Force Base, Washington, D.C., the body of the late President Kennedy was placed in a U.S. Navy ambulance, which was driven by S.A. Greer to the U.S. Naval Hospital, Bethesda, Maryland, with S.A. Landis and George Berkeley and myself in the front seat. Mrs. Kennedy, along with Mr. Robert Kennedy and General McHugh, rode in the rear of the ambulance. S.A.'s Hill and O'Leary rode in an accompanying vehicle. At the U.S. Naval Hospital, S.A.'s Hill and Landis remained with Mrs. Kennedy near her quarters, located in the towers of the center. S.A.'s Greer and O'Leary and myself accompanied the body to the morgue. S.A. O'Leary remained in the morgue only briefly. S.A. Greer and myself remained with the body in the U.S. Naval Hospital along with Agents Francis O'Neill Jr. and James Siebert of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, witnessing the autopsy performed by members of the U.S. Naval Medical Corps, and the embalming services done by the staff of Joseph Galler's Funeral Directors, Washington, D.C. At 3:56 a.m. on Saturday, November 23rd, the body of the late President Kennedy was transported in a U.S. Navy ambulance from the U.S. Naval Hospital, Bethesda, Maryland, to the White House with S.A. Greer driving the ambulance and myself riding in the front seat. Mrs. Kennedy and Mr. Robert Kennedy rode in the rear of the ambulance. S.A.'s Hill and Landis rode in the accompanying vehicles. We arrived at the White House at 10:24 a.m., and the body was placed in the East Room. Next statement, another statement of witness. Roy H. Kellerman, Assistant Special Agent in Charge. Dated November 29th, 63, Volume 18, page 724-7. Must be talking about the Warren Commission. He said he heard a firecracker-like noise, and I immediately heard what I firmly believe was the president's voice. My God, I'm hit. That's impossible. He was struck in the fucking throat. He didn't say shit. I turned around to find out what happened when 2 additional shots rang out, and the president slumped into Mrs. Kennedy's lap, and Governor Connolly fell into Mrs. Connolly's lap. This version, I believe, is not confirmed by the photographic evidence, especially the Zapruder film, which do not show Kellerman turning immediately. This must be Weisberg's personal notes. Note the streamlined version of the shots. He then says that he instructed Greer to speed the car up and by radio informed Lawson of what had happened. This again seems to be in contradiction to the versions of other agents, especially that of Roberts, who says that he himself radioed to the lead car. It would seem that all of the radios were turned to the same frequency and could have heard all messages. On page 742 of this same volume, Special Agent Clint Hill, the one who jumped on the back of the president's car, said that as I jumped onto the president's automobile, I heard Kellerman call to the nearest hospital quick. This is not of crucial importance, although the 2 agents do seem to disagree with Kellerman. I pointed out only because the newspaper accounts of Kellerman's statements indicate he is evading, and there is something he either wants not to say or not to admit. Kellerman's account of the assassination takes up approximately 6 lines of type in his statement of almost 4 pages. The brevity certainly seems inappropriate and entirely inadequate. He also says that he sent 2 agents into the hospital who returned with stretchers, which is not in conformity with the hospital personnel. He said that, quote, we placed the president on the stretcher, which also is not in conformity with the versions of the hospital personnel. Although he says, quote, I accompanied the president to the emergency room. His eyes were closed, but I could see no visible damage to his face. He makes no reference to any kind of president's injuries or their nature. He says he phoned the White House at 12:38 p.m. Central Time. This is the time to which other time references, such as 12:43 p.m. previously referred to, had been changed. On page 726, he says that at the airport in Washington, quote, I told Chief Rowley the cars would arrive at Andrews about 8 p.m. and suggested he assign field agents to them to completely go over them for any evidence that might be found. Again, I want to make reference to the report that the car in which the president was shot was washed at the hospital. He says that he and Agent Greer, quote, remained in the morgue and viewed the autopsy examinations which were performed by Vice Admiral Galway, commanding officer, NNMC, Chief Pathologist, Commander James Humes, and Lieutenant Colonel Pierre A. Fink, who is Chief Military Environmental Pathology Division and Chief of Wound Ballistics Pathology Branch, and J. Thornton Boswell, Commander Medical Corps, U.S. Navy, together with Navy medical staff. In the next paragraph, quote, I summoned S.A. Hill down to the morgue to view the body and to witness the damage of the gunshot wounds. End quote. Note, he himself says nothing about the nature of the wounds here. He acknowledges receipt of, quote, all film x-rays that were used during this autopsy, but says nothing about the fragments measuring 7 by 2 millimeter and 2 by 1 millimeter, which the autopsy report says were given to FBI agents O'Neill and Siebert, who executed a receipt that the autopsy report says was attached, but was in fact not attached to the autopsy report appearing in the Commission's report and in the Commission's 26 supplemental volumes. Almost all of Agent Kellerman's report deals with matters other than the assassination. Under date of November 30th, 1963, is a memorandum by Kellerman to his chief of security measures taken for the late President Kennedy and President Johnson. There's another page and a half of typing, which again avoids saying anything at all about the assassination. That's fascinating, isn't it? All right, here we have a letter to Dear Howard from, obviously, Harold Weisberg. Dear Howard, Rowley's 11-17-63 to Aitchison and Kellerman's 12-1-66 to Rowley are written as though the Attorney General had not promulgated his executive order on the transfer of all evidence to the archives, yet both are dated after that order had been very well publicized. Note also that Kellerman seems to have received a promotion at this point close to his retirement. The subject of the Rowley men is photographs and x-rays of autopsy of President Kennedy. The subject is not once mentioned in the short memo. I have Aikens of 11-4, I do not recall it. Taken literally and taken in context, the third graph refers to the windshield only. With the earlier transfer of the photos and x-rays, it would not seem possible for them to be the evidence referred to, and there are no visible signs of masking to obliterate content of the memo. What had happened just prior to this and what just might have triggered the 1966 transfer is that the Saturday Evening Post, then of some influence in circulation, had gotten interested in the assassination story. Dick Whalen had been spinning his wheels in Dallas and elsewhere until his friendly editor of the right, Mike Mooney, sent him to see me. Dick told me of having been promised access by Aitchison. You have probably read the copy of his notes he gave me. Then suddenly Aitchison could not keep his word. I don't know if this would be clarifies by the Aitchison letter or what is not provided, but Rowley said was attached his letter to DJ. Richmond's 1128 may be the response. One might conjecture over the reasons for the inapplicable description of the memo, but I think there is no reasonable doubt that the description does not fit. This leads to how come, what conjectures. Best, Harold. He goes off on tangents sometimes. Here's another letter. Let's see what he says here. This one is to Roy Kellerman. Dear Mr. Kellerman, this letter requires no response and is not written with the intent of prompting one. With all the trouble you have had, I just want you to know how beautiful your daughter was. Erect eyes flashing with her pride in her father. I'm grateful to her for coming up after my speech last night, grateful that she heard part of what I usually say and do believe. You are entitled to be as proud of her as you must be. I asked her to show and explain certain things to you. I hope she understood them and was able to make them understood to you. Should you at any time want to know anything you think I might know that is of interest to you, you need only ask me. You will be under no obligation, and I will ask nothing of you in return. Whatever you might ask of me, I will keep in confidence. There is nothing I would tell you that you would have to keep confidential, and so you will have no doubt of what I believe, for I have said it often in public, including in both radio and television. I believe all of the late president's escorts are brave and dedicated men who were in no way responsible for the tragedy. I wish the record had been left less beclouded. Yeah, I really don't like Harold Weisberg at all. The guy is, sometimes he's a fucking ass kisser. And he just, how many fucking years did he spend on this thing and he couldn't figure shit out? Yeah. All right, moving on. Another letter to Mr. Kellerman. Mr. Kellerman, like my previous letter, this one does not require an answer. Though now that you have retired, I would very much like to talk to you on a confidential basis both ways. I do regret you were not a witness in New Orleans, for I believe you do have unrecorded knowledge that is important. I also believe you will be better off when you are not alone in having this knowledge. However, I have two purposes in writing you, and both are to give you information. You may recall that when you testified before the Warren Commission, a great effort was made to make it seem that injury to his voice apparatus made it impossible for the late president to have spoken. Hence, you could not have heard what you said. Exactly. Well, according to the testimony of Colonel Fink in New Orleans, this is not so. That shot did not impair the president's ability to speak. Bullshit. It did not hit his voice box. It hit him dead in the fucking center of the throat. Fuck you. Despite this additional part of the nasty campaign to destroy what you tried to say. See, here he is, Harold Weisberg, kissing Kellerman's ass when Kellerman was a fucking participant in this thing. I have now completed 2 parts of a 3-way study of the autopsy. I have much that is not generally known, including a number of documents thought to have been destroyed. If you have any interest in what I have learned, you may have access to it. There are many things you did not understand, as I then would not had I been in your place. But if I correctly read what you did say and the way it was handled, you observed accurately and understood correctly, that is, those things you could. One thing you were not asked that may not strike you as important, I think, is. I think before memory further dimes recollection, if you have not already done it, you should make a note of every person who was present at the autopsy for whatever length of time, his function, if any. You will better understand the importance of this if you read Colonel Fink's testimony and the first part of my study. The O'Neill-Seibert report is entirely incomplete on this and in the most significant ways. I have this testimony if you want to read it. You will be under no obligation if you want to with this or anything else. If you recall your drives to Camp David, we are 3 miles to the left of the first Fort Detrick exit on 15 near Shookstown, and you also should know that whether or not Secret Service still has them, the historical record does not include the receipts you signed. I have sought them and have this in writing from the head of the archives. These are not all the evidence that has disappeared. Some of this pictures and x-rays of the autopsies have too. I do suggest that your personal interest requires the making of a record the Warren Commission sought to avoid. There are other things some of you who I believe were dedicated to your responsibilities should know if you ever want to. I do trust you to maintain my confidence as I would yours. All right, notes on Kellerman's second statement, 11/30/63, second page. Subject is 3 lines long of security measures from Love Field to Bethesda, then the White House. I also mentioned the shift reorganizations, the LBJ security, the trip to the Navy hospital. This says the 4 agents also remained through the, I can't read what that says, Meblming, whatever. This one also fails to mention Berkeley's departure. It is specific in not placing him in the ambulance. What is not clear is why it had to be written at all. Interesting. All right, here's a little clip of, looks like Kellerman's obituary. Post 33084, St. Petersburg, Florida. Roy Kellerman, 69, Secret Service agent who was riding in the front seat of the car when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, died here on March 22nd. The cause of death was not reported. Mr. Kellerman served with the White House Secret Service detail during the administrations of President Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. He was assistant administrator of the service when he retired in 1968. All right, now we have a pretty lengthy 20 pages of notes on Secret Service statements by Harold Weisberg. It starts with Roy Kellerman. I'm assuming it has more than just Kellerman in here, but it focuses on Kellerman if I'm not mistaken. Secret Service statements of witnesses. Roy H. Kellerman, March 9th, 64, 2H62-112 testimony. This then assistant special agent in charge of the White House detail, 48 years old, was in his 23rd year of service with the Secret Service following an apprenticeship with the Michigan State Police. The first several pages are taken up with his background education, the early part of the day, November 22nd, 63, and details of the president's car, etc. To and including part of page 67. He then is led into a discussion of the organization and facilities of the motorcade, including its communications equipment and composition. On the important item of the space between the presidential and follow-up cars, which other agents place in the neighborhood of 20 to 25 feet, Kellerman said, I would say from the practice of that driver that he was 5 feet would be a maximum. His emphasis was even greater. Then he said the follow-up cars, I'm positive it was right on our rear wheels. Discussion of the progress of the motorcade, page 69 and 73. After making the turn onto Elm Street, Kellerman said that they had no more than passed the first sign since removed when he heard a report like a firecracker pop. He said he had turned his head to the right because he was sure the sound came from the right and perhaps into the rear. He believes he heard the president say, my God, I am hit. And he said, I turned around, and as he got his hands up, here like this. I am not in a position to completely contradict Mr. Kellerman, but from what I can see of the printed Zapruder films, his recollection is in error as to when he turned. Kellerman said that he had seen enough to know the president was hit, and so in the same motion, He come right back and he grabbed the speaker and said to the driver, "Let's get out of here. We are hit," and grabbed the mic. And I said, quote, "to Lawson in the lead car to get to the hospital immediately," continuing, quote, "now in the seconds that I talked just now, a flurry of shells come into the car. I then looked back. At this time, Mr. Hill, who was riding on the left front bumper of our follow-up car, was on the back of the trunk. The president was sideways down in the back seat." Again, Kellerman's recollection is unsupported by that of others. It is extremely improbable that he issued the instructions and grabbed the radio mic in the interval between the first and second shots. Note, however, that he referred to the, quote, "flurry of shells," page 75. He repeated the phrase properly, flurry of shot, on the next page. Of the shots after the first, he said there were two together like a double bang. He described the interval between the second and third shot as that of a sonic boom, in which the two overpressures can be distinguished. These are so close together that frequently only one is heard on the ground. He said that after he spoke to Lawson by radio, he looked around and saw Special Agent Hill on the back of the presidential car. This would seem to indicate against Kellerman's radio call was later than he recalled. Okay, so if you'll remember in McIntyre photo number 2, Kellerman is on, never mind, forget what I just said, because we're not talking about the president's limousine. We're talking about the Secret Service car. Okay, Kellerman was in the president's limousine. So I was going to say, because who was in the front seat? It was Emory Roberts in the front seat of the Secret Service car, and Emory Roberts is on the radio at that time in McIntyre number 2. You can't see what's going on in McIntyre number 1 as far as the radio goes. Hill was not only on the car, he was across the trunk with Mrs. Kennedy. I do not believe it is important, but other testimony also indicates that the first instructions also came from the follow-up car. All right, so once again, another person testifying in statement that Clint Hill never got off the trunk. He hopped on the trunk, and that was it. So once again, who was the person standing in the back seat of the president's limousine with the rifle? I do not believe it is important, but other testimony also indicates the first instructions came from the follow-up car. I don't understand the relevance of that. After describing the splatter from the president's shot in the head, Kellerman re-emphasizes the short space between the second and third shot. Again, he emphasizes this, again, with the sonic boom comparison, and is very definite in his language. He referred to them as two sharp reports. He also said that definitely there was a difference between the sound of the first and the sound of the second and third shots. Under questioning, he addressed himself to the number of shots. His conclusion, of course, is mine. Quote, "Mr. Spector, Mr. Kellerman, you said earlier that there were at least 2 additional shots. Is there any area in your mind or possibility as you recollect that situation that there could have been more than 2 shots, or are you able to say with any certainty?" Mr. Kellerman, I'm going to say that I have, from the firecracker report and 2 other shots that I know, those were 3 shots. But Mr. Spector of President Kennedy had, from all reports, 4 wounds. Governor Connolly, 3. There had got to be more than 3 shots, gentlemen. Duh. When asked, he repeated it with the conclusion, quote, "there have got to be more than 3 shots," page 78. Under questioning, he persists in using the description, quote, "flurry." He has no independent recollection of the number of shots. Spector then argues with him about the number of wounds, saying Kellerman's characterization is only lay opinion, to which Kellerman agrees. When Spector wants to continue this discussion about wounds, Kellerman asks if they can't proceed logically with the trip to the hospital, to which Spector agreed. He knew Connolly was alive because Connolly responded to conversation. The stretchers were out immediately, and they were put the governor onto the first stretcher. Then they got Mrs. Connolly and then Mrs. Kennedy, and Hill laid his coat over the president's face and shoulders. Hill, Kellerman, and 2 other people unknown to Kellerman put the president on the other stretcher. He was wheeled into the hospital accompanied by Kellerman and Hill. The president was taken to the right, Connolly to the left. Kellerman said, "I did not see any wound in the president's face." And Spector noted in the record indicating with your hand that at the moment, the front part of his face, to which Kellerman replied, "Right, sir." This is interesting, in view of Dr. McClellan's statement about the wound in the left temple that was fatal, and Mr. Kellerman's subsequent reference. It is interesting that Spector cared to limit the part of the front of the president's head on which there was a visible wound. Kellerman did not see any of the president's back or the back of his head. He describes what transpired when he left the emergency room. Kellerman describes the means by which he phoned the White House and recounts the disagreement he had on time with Gerald Bain. Kellerman told Bain to write down the time. Bain wrote down 41 minutes after the hour. Kellerman remembers 38. Without any further identification than appears in the record at this point, there may in fact be no disagreement because the exact moment referred to is never described. If Bain was talking about the time, he was told to write down the time, and if Kellerman was talking about the arrival at the hospital, there would not only be no conflict, but they would apparently be in agreement. Kellerman then goes into a description of the president's wounds as he observed them in the morgue at the Naval Hospital that night. He describes the large area of the skull that was missing and its general outline. He decides, apparently based on what he learned at the hospital or in the autopsy report, that the wound on the back of the head was the point of entry for the larger wound. Obviously, he had no way of knowing this for himself, but he is allowed to testify to it. In misrepresenting this wound, quote, Mr. Spector, indicating the bottom of the hairline immediately to the right of the ear, about the lower third of the ear. Mr. Kellerman, right, but it was in the hairline, sir. Mr. Spector says, in this hairline. Kellerman says, yes. Mr. Spector says, near the end of his hairline. Mr. Kellerman says, yes, sir. Note the line of this injury is described by Spector as, quote, about the lower third of the ear. Exhibits 385 and 386 actually have this wound extending above the top of the ear. I have no way of knowing which is right, nor do I have any reason to believe that Kellerman made a precise enough observation. I point out the conflict because there are other substantial reasons for doubting the accuracy of the representation in Exhibits 385 and 386. Note again that it was near the end of the hairline. Any good photograph of the president can identify that point. Then to the wound that Kellerman initially called a shoulder wound, in which the commission persistently calls a neck wound. Mr. Kellerman, the other wound that I noticed was on his shoulder. Mr. Spector, which shoulder? Mr. Kellerman, his right shoulder. Spector, what was the general position with regards to the back? Right, straight. Mr. Spector, no, upper shoulder. Lower shoulder, how far below the neckline would you say? Mr. Kellerman, the upper neckline, sir, and that large muscle between the shoulder and the neck, just below it. The upper neckline, sir, in that large muscle between the shoulder and the neck just below it. Yes, 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 yes. I'm fucking getting excited over this one statement here on page 6 of 20. Okay, this is extremely fucking important because he's not describing the shot that came in the back, right? That came in 6 inches below the neckline. This is in the upper fucking neckline, as is also shown in the commission's jacket exhibit that shows the second bullet wound in the back. Okay, he was shot twice in the back, once in the standard place that we're all familiar with, allegedly the magic bullet struck him in, and then one just below the upper neckline, which Kellerman is describing here. Okay. Which is corroborated by the fucking jacket exhibit number, which shows the hole in the fucking jacket, right? So thank God for that. This is the second piece of evidence demonstrating that Kennedy was shot in the back twice by Emilio Santana at the Daltex. Rightly or wrongly, here again, Kellerman is in dispute with the, what does that say? I can't tell what the fuck that says. There's something of Bethesda Naval Hospital and described it as below the muscle between the shoulder and the neck. The artist's drawing has this wound just barely, not missing the president's body entirely. Kellerman's reference to the anterior neck wound is interesting. He says that it is, I quote, I have to collaborate with the medical people in Dallas and said that he had entry in the throat or an exit. It is never possible to reach into a man's mind, but if the doctors had told him they didn't know whether it was a wound of entry or exit, he would never have phrased it in this fashion. It seems to me that he has begun by saying exactly what the doctors told him, that the anterior wound was one of entry, and then corrected himself because he knew why he should. There is further discussion about the wounds that Kellerman saw or didn't see at Dallas, how Hill covered the president with his coat down to the president's waistline to eliminate any gruesome pictures, and that when last Kellerman saw the president in the emergency room, the president's tie and collar were still in place. Kellerman said that he never saw any blood in this area of the president's body or any place else in front. Technically, this may be true, since he said the president was entirely covered, but how he could have avoided seeing the blood on the shirt is difficult to understand. Kellerman also did not observe any holes in the president's clothing on the front. Then there is the discussion of Governor Conley's wounds, of which Kellerman has no personal knowledge, page 83. Kellerman saw what Governor Conley's hand, which he said the governor had lying on his stomach as he was being wheeled in was bloody, but he recalled no blood on the stomach part of the governor's body. In view of the fact that on page 79, Kellerman identified himself as one of 3 men who lifted the governor from the car and put him on the stretcher, this previously cited incident and several other inaccurate recollections by Kellerman would seem to identify him as not the most precisely accurate observer. The commission's questioning then goes into the damage to the president's vehicle. Kellerman identifies a damage to the area of the frame around the windshield between the visors, when the visors are raised upwards, as was the case at Dallas Exhibit 349, 16H 945. He did not notice this until upward of the 27th, or any time beginning 5 days after the assassination. The car was then in the White House garage, and the windshield was about to be removed. Kellerman said he had no occasion to examine the windshield area between the assassination and the 27th. From the inside, the injury, which is described as an indentation, is directly to the right of the mirror holder. It would thus be helpful to know where the mirror is located, because it would seem improbable that had the object causing the damage from straight back or anything close to that direction, the question of damage to the mirror might become pertinent. There is no discussion of the mirror or its location, hence we do not know. There is likewise no discussion of the extent of this damage, its depth, etc. The picture is unclear, as most of the Commission's photographs, but it seems as though a piece of chrome has been raised upwards a half inch or more for a length of perhaps 3 inches, tapering towards the edge. When asked what prompted him to make this investigation on or about November 27th, Kellerman replies, quote, "Mr. Kellerman, first, Mr. Congressman, I wanted to look at this car let me get back a little bit. When this car was checked over that night for its return to Washington, I was informed the following day of the pieces of these missiles that were found in the front seat. And I believe aside from the skull that was in the rear seat, I couldn't conceive even from elevation how this shot hit President Kennedy like it did. I wanted to view this vehicle, whether this was a slant blow off the car, whether it hit the car first and then hit him, or what other marks are on this vehicle. And that is what prompted me to go around and check over it myself." Representative Ford, had anyone told you of this indentation prior to your own personal investigation? Kellerman, not of the windshield, no, sir. Ford, you were the first one to find this indentation. Mr. Kellerman, I believe I am the first one who noticed this thing up on the bar. Page 85. If it is true, as Kellerman says without contradiction, that he was the first to notice this, one can only ask what kind of examination did this car get. The commission then goes into a lengthy discussion of the damage to the windshield itself, apparently from the inside, page 85. This extends for several pages and includes a discussion of added damage and removal of the windshield. They then return to Kellerman's reasons for believing that there were more than 3 bullets. He says, quote, "When they examined that vehicle that night when it was brought back to Washington, D.C., 2 pieces of a bullet or bullets were found on the passenger side of the floorboard on the right front seat. He was told this by Agent Floyd Boring. They also found a piece of the president's skull that night. Kellerman does not say and is not asked at what point in the car. Kellerman concluded the evidence found in the car was turned over to the FBI, quote, because they were assigned to go over the car. If the Secret Service found this evidence that night, and if Kellerman 5 days or more later found unreported damage to the vehicle, what kind of examination was made? There is further discussion of Governor Connolly's wounds and some of the Zapruder films, page 91. Kellerman saw the Zapruder films in color and some black and white films. Kellerman marks in red on Exhibit 347 the point at which he believed the president's car was at the time the first bullet and at the time of the second and third bullets. He describes this as a guess. And the mark for the second and third bullets, he said, is about the same. He is asked an FBI report dated December 10th, 63, referring to an interview allegedly with him by Special Agent Francis O'Neill and James W. Siebert, quoting Kellerman as having said on hearing a shot, he immediately turned around, looking past Governor Connolly in the back of him to the president, and quotes the president as saying, "Get me to a hospital." He denies having said the president said this. He also denied having been interviewed by these agents, but said that they were present at the Naval Hospital with him on the night of the 22nd. He was interviewed, he said, around the 27th. He recalls only one discussion with them at the Naval Hospital. Mr. Kellerman, this was before we even knew that a shell had been found from the hole in the president's shoulder. We couldn't determine what happened to it. They couldn't find it in the morgue. They couldn't find any leeway as to whatever happened to the shell when it hit the president's shoulder. Where did it go? So our contention was that while he was on the stretcher in Dallas and the neurosurgeon was working over him, no doubt with pressure on the heart, this thing worked itself out. Mr. Spector, when you say our contention, what do you mean by that? Mr. Kellerman, one of these agents, I forget which one it was, it could have been Siebert or O'Neill, but I'm not sure. No, Kellerman refers to this bullet as the one that, quote, had been found from the hole in the president's shoulder. He refers to this again shortly with with further respect to the autopsy. Mr. Kellerman, there were 3 gentlemen who were performing this autopsy, a Colonel Fink during the examination of the president from the hole that was in his shoulder, and with a probe, and we were standing right alongside of him. He is probing inside the shoulder with his instrument, and I said, Colonel, where did it go? He said, there are no lanes for an outlet of this entry in this man's shoulder. Mr. Spector, did you say anything in response to that? Mr. Kellerman, I said, Colonel, would it have been possible that while he was on the stretcher in Dallas that it worked itself out? And he said, yes, page 93. Note that Colonel Fink is doing the probing, not Commander Humes. Colonel Fink then was not just an observer. There is then discussion of the head wound, following which they return to the shoulder wound. Kellerman consistently refers to the lower posterior wound as a shoulder wound, as the commission consistently refers to it, except the first few occasions when they slip, as a neck wound. He said all the comments made about the path of the bullet, which here Spector refers to as into Mr. Kennedy's back, were made by Colonel Fink, who Kellerman says, quote, did all the talking, sir. He was the only one. Again, Spector questions him about the FBI report, and Spector directs his attention, quote, to the issue about which way you turned. The report does not say which way he turned, but apparently in inference is he turned to his left, and Spector asks, did that describe a turn to the right or to the left? Page 94. Kellerman said he will, quote, stand on my original statement that he had made during his testimony, and he insists he never told anybody he turned away except to the right. He also insists that the Zapruder films coincide with this. He identifies 2 photographs, Exhibit 352 and 353, 17H 948. He describes these as views of the back seat of the presidential car after the occupants were removed. He does not know when the picture was taken and says it could have been taken while at the White House garage. He says they show blood and flower petals. Page 95. The discussion then turns to what happened at the hospital, what agents took up what positions inside the hospital, and their preparations. Agents took up what positions in the hospital and the preparations for their return to Washington. Kellerman then voluntarily goes into the question of the removal of the body from Dallas, describing the visit of an unnamed gentleman who, quote, came into the little doctor's room. I don't recall his name, but he represented himself to be from the health department or commission or some form. He said to me, there's been a homicide here. You won't be able to remove the body. We will have to take it down to the mortuary and have an autopsy. I said, no, we're not. And he said, we have a law here whereby you have to comply with it. Quote, with that, Dr. Berkeley walked in and I said, doctor, this man is from some health unit in town. He tells me we can't remove this body. The doctor became a little enraged. He said, we are removing it. He said, this is the President of the United States, and there should be some consideration in an event like this. And I told this gentleman, I said, you're going to have to come up with something a little stronger. You're going to have to give me the law on this. Body can't be removed. Quote, so he frantically called everybody he could think of, and he hasn't got an answer. Nobody's home. Shortly, he leaves his little room, and it seems like a few minutes he's back, and he has another gentleman with him, and he said, this is... the name escapes me. He said, this is a judge here in Dallas, and said he will tell you whether you can remove the body or not. I said, it doesn't make any difference. We're going to remove it. And I said, Judge, you know who I am? He said, yes. And I said, there must be something in your thinking here that we don't have to go through this agony. The family doesn't have to go through this. We will take care of the matter when we get back to Washington. The poor man looked at me and said, I know who you are, he said, and I can't help you out. I said, all right, sir. But then I happened to look to the right, and I can see that the casket coming on rollers. And I just left the room, and I let it out through the emergency entrance, and we got to the ambulance and put it in, shut the door after Mrs. Kennedy and General McHugh and Clinton in the rear part of this ambulance. Oh, hold on a second, hang on. Ding, 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 ding. Okay, stop the presses. So right now we're talking about, what fucking time is it? So 12:30, 12:45, 1 o'clock, about 1 o'clock-ish, okay? He's saying that General McHugh is at the fucking hospital, all right? But General McHugh, if you'll recall, and I know this is going way off base here, but General McHugh and Clifton, what the fuck was his name? The other general, Clifton, whatever the fuck. Those two guys were supposed to be in the Mercury station wagon provided by Buck fucking Farrell, of all people, which was photographed in Dealey Plaza with the person getting into the car, whereas the official documentation says the person's getting out of the car. It said it was Reedy, right? But no, Reedy was on the fucking press bus. And General McHugh and Clifton, I can't figure out where the fuck they were, because they were not in that fucking Mercury station wagon. I'm pretty confident they were on the VIP bus, but this would have to indicate the VIP bus made it to the Trade Mart and then took them back to Parkland Hospital. But I can't find fucking anywhere the statements from Clifton and McHugh, how they got from the Trade Mart to Parkland Hospital, really how they got from anywhere in the motorcade. Like, that information is purely is obfuscated because it clearly shows someone getting into the fucking car. And based on my research, I thought that person was, the fuck was his name? Robert Earl Croft. The person pretending to be Robert Earl Croft, because Robert Earl Croft certainly is not fucking Robert Earl Croft in the fucking Dealey Plaza pictures, okay? End of story. So that whole thing still needs to get to we need to get to the bottom of that shit. I don't know if we ever will be able to. But when we figure out where General Clifton and McHugh were, then we'll fucking be one little bit closer. But at this point, McHugh is at motherfucking Parkland about 1 o'clock. Make of that what you fucking will. All right, quote, I'm looking around for Mr. Greer, and I don't spot him directly because I want to get out of here in a hurry. And I recognize Agent Berger, and I said, Berger, you get in the front seat and drive, and Mr. Stout, you get in the middle, and I will get on this side, and we are leaving. Mr. Lawson, I would say, was in a police car that led us away from Parkland Memorial Hospital. As we're leaving, a gentleman taps on the driver's window, and they roll it down, and he says, I will meet you at the mortuary. Yes, sir. We went to the airport, gentlemen. This version by Kellerman is not completely consistent with other versions. It makes clear that Kellerman was determined by the president's body had to go to Washington immediately, regardless of any provision of Texas law. After describing briefly the trip to the airport and the provisions made in the plane to accommodate the casket, there is this exchange. Mr. Spector, was there any further difficulty of any sorts? Mr. Kellerman, no. Mr. Spector, imposed by any Texas officials on the removal of the body? Mr. Kellerman, no, sir. Whatever happened to the hearse, I don't know. I never left the plane. Then follows discussion of what happened on the plane, who was present at the swearing in, its departure from Dallas and arrival in Washington, and things he did on the way, page 98, especially in making arrangements, the details of the trip to the hospital, and who accompanied him and the president's body. During the autopsy, he was asked if he left that room, and he replied that he did on 3 different occasions, each one for a minute or two, to make a phone call. And Mr. Kellerman, okay, first I was informed by a Navy personnel that I should call Mr. Rowley. There wasn't any phone. There wasn't a phone in the room. But I wasn't aware of this at the time. So I left and walked out into the corridor and called him. This was my first knowledge that they had found a projectile. The second call, I think, I called home. That was my first call to home, and that was it. Mr. Spector, now the projectile that you just referred to was found where? Kellerman, this was the projectile that was reportedly given to our special agent Richard Johnson as we were leaving the hospital in Dallas. That's on page 99. Kellerman said he obtained this information about 9 o'clock. The bullet apparently had come in the possession of Secret Service much earlier. He decided to call Secret Service agent Hill into view the president's body because he thought it would be better to have more witnesses. Of the x-rays of the head, quote, yes, of the numerous x-rays that were taken mainly of the skull, the head, the reason for it was that through all the probing which these gentlemen were trying to pick up little pieces of evidence in the form of shell fragments, they were unable to locate any. From the x-rays, when you place the x-ray up against the light, the whole head looked like a little mass of stars. There must have been 30, 40 lights where these pieces were so minute that they couldn't be reached. However, all through this series of x-rays, this was the only one they found through x-ray that was above the right eye, and they removed it. The fragment was removed from behind the president's eye, he described as about the tip of a match head or a little larger. The afternoon session began with a recapitulation of parts of Kellerman's morning testimony. In addition, he is asked about whether he saw a priest at the hospital. Too. He said there were no stretcher bearers at the hospital, whereas the stretchers were ready and waiting to come out. And although he said, I did not at the time see any man in a white uniform outside, indicating a medical person. In fact, there was a nurse with at least the president's stretcher, and doctors were all inside the emergency rooms waiting. I cite this again to show that Kellerman's observations are not precise. He had other things on his mind, other responsibilities, and he has been asked to testify about things which he either had no reason to recall or does not accurately recall. He is then asked about the autopsy, and based on estimates, he thought they were at the Naval Hospital at about 7 o'clock. He figured that at the latest, the autopsy began at 7:30, and that he and the family left the hospital at 3:56 a.m., prior to which the undertaking people had spent perhaps 2 hours with the president's body. Hence, he reasoned the autopsy itself was completed by 2 o'clock in the morning, and that the actual autopsy work consumed 4.5 to 5 hours. He was present all the time except as previously described, and he was there during the time the funeral director's personnel was preparing the body. He has some interesting comments to make when asked about the autopsy itself. Mr. Spector, now with respect to the time you were present at the autopsy, was there any conversation of any sort concerning the possibility of a point of entry from the front of the president's body? Mr. Kellerman, no. When Spector changes the subject, Kellerman asks to elaborate on the answer he had just given. Mr. Kellerman, just for the record, I wish to have this down. While the president is in the morgue, he is lying flat. And with the part of the skull removed and the hole in the throat, nobody was aware until they lifted him up that there was a hole in his shoulder. That was the first concrete evidence that they knew that the man was hit in the back first. Mr. Spector, when did they lift him up and first observe the hole in the shoulder? Mr. Kellerman, they had been working on him for quite some time. Mr. Spector, through the photos and other things they do through an autopsy, and I believe it was this Colonel Fink who raised him, and there was a clean hole. Mr. Spector, what was said, if any, by those present at the autopsy concerning the wound in the throat? Mr. Kellerman, to go back just a little further, the reason for the hole in the throat, the tracheotomy, I am thinking, they were of the opinion that when he was shot in the head and they found this piece remaining above the eye underneath, I'm sure there was some concern as to where the outlet was and whether they considered this is an an assumption now, whether they considered this, that there was a hole in the throat prior to the tracheotomy. I don't know, but to complete the examination, they lifted him up by the shoulders, and there was this hole. This does put the autopsy and the experts conducting it in somewhat of a different light than what was cast upon them by the commission. It is understandable that the doctors at Parkland, once their patient was dead and to be taken away from them, would have had no reason to lift the body. This is not understandable at the time of the autopsy. It raises the question in my mind that perhaps is prompted by my knowledge that the autopsy report, in part, is based upon newspaper accounts of dubious authenticity and secondhand information obtained by telephone after the completion of the autopsy. The inference is clear. The doctors were seeking to establish a case, not to learn independently what they could in order to provide a precise scientific description and conclusion based exclusively upon their own examination. Kellerman is then asked about his own reactions on the scene, whether in retrospect he thinks he should have tried to jump upon the president to protect him from further injury, page 104. And then commission gets into generalities of the Secret Service's operation to protect the president and the specifics of this particular case, page 105. Kellerman goes over the division of responsibilities and the functions of the various people, page 106, with the questioning by Congressman Ford for more than 6 pages before Spector interrupts to tell the congressman they are going to have another witness better qualified to answer these questions, page 110. However, several interesting exchanges occurred during the congressman's interrogation. Representative Ford, in other words, PRS never turned over to you any information about the dangerous individuals in any one of these communities on this trip. Mr. Kellerman, that's right. Representative Ford, is this unusual? Mr. Kellerman, yes. But let me reserve the right to recheck that question. May I? And that's on page 108. Representative Ford, was it surprising to you that when the president was going to a city as large as Dallas, that there were no names turned over to you, either by your protective research section or by any other federal agents, individuals, or an individual dangerous to the president? Mr. Kellerman, I recall you... I recall to give you an answer, Congressman, that it did seem strange that here we are hitting 5 cities in one state, and from the apparent trouble Ambassador Stevenson had down there one evening, we certainly should have had some information on somebody. In response to a question by the congressman about whether or not usually the agents protecting the president receive information from PRS and others, Kellerman replied, quote, "I don't recall any information whatsoever except that picket thing." Representative Ford, it is surprising to me as well, and I gather it was certainly of reflection surprising to you. Mr. Kellerman, yes, it is. Representative Ford, was this in itself any warning to you that there might be some breakdown in the system? Kellerman, gee, no, I never cherished that thought, sir. Several other interesting revelations conclude Kellerman's appearance. The first reveals the intrinsically shabby nature of the investigation, whose thoroughness was assumed and in fact widely publicized and praised for its exhaustiveness. Representative Ford, when were you first interviewed by anyone regarding the directions from which the shots came? Mr. Kellerman, I don't recall ever being interviewed. Here we have the man who, of all those on scene, was most directly responsible for the president's safety, not even being asked by anybody what he believed of the source of the shots. Again, this shows the commission did not want to learn anything except what it could use to substantiate the FBI reports. And on the subject of the time and attention of the members of the commission could devote to its operation, quote, Representative Ford, I believe that is all. I have to go back to a very important committee meeting, Mr. Chairman. I may be able to get back later, Mr. Chief Justice. The Chairman, I will be here the rest of the afternoon, so there will be no necessity of your coming back if you're tied up. Thank you very much for presiding all day. Apparently, the commission members thought that as long as one of them was there, that was enough. All they had to do was to lend their presence to dignify or legitimize what the staff was doing. The country and the world at large expected more of the members of the commission. All were known to be busy men, busier than most in our national life. However, they did assume a responsibility, and with the assumption of the responsibility went a major obligation to the country, to history, and to the late president and his family. Mr. Craig and his associates, whose almost total silence while they were allegedly representing the interests of Oswald, I have previously noted, finally asked the question. It is to search out some hidden fact, some not quite understood facet, anything at all that might be of benefit to their client, the late Oswald? No. Here again, and I think this is only the second time I have noted a question by any of them. They asked a question on the commission's behalf. Mr. Craig, Mr. Kellerman, is there any special agent in charge of the protection of the person next in line in succession to your knowledge? Mr. Kellerman, I think Mr. Rowley would like to man that. I think they had a little difficulty to find a man. Mr. Craig, there is no such person now? Mr. Kellerman, no, they have made numerous attempts with the people, and so far they've got a negative reply. Again, what a commentary on the protection of our public officials when the Secret Service has difficulty locating a man to protect the next in line of secession. Wild, huh? So that's the conclusion of Harold Weisberg's review of Agent Roy Kellerman and his testimony before the Warren Commission that day. He was in the passenger seat of the president's limousine. He would have seen clearly that Greer stopped the fucking car and let Jack Valenti hop in. Clearly. So he's a lying fucking cunt traitor, just like the rest of them. That's going to do it for today, guys. Come back in tomorrow. We'll be on part 7. And if you haven't bought the book, buy the book. Hit me up if you want to get a signed copy. And that's going to do it. I'll see you guys tomorrow.